Hey everybody, Jeremy Waddell from theoryofcardiology.com. I want to talk a little bit here about depolarization and why we care about depolarization. So look at page 49 in the book and kind of start to follow along there. The section on depolarization takes up a few pages, and so just kind of start on 49 and keep going. So when we look at a normal resting cell, all right, and these are the myocardial cells themselves. When we look at the resting cells, you'll see that you have calcium and sodium who are outside the cell, and we have potassium that's inside the cell. Now, is there a little potassium somewhere out extracellularly? Yes. Is there a little bit of sodium somewhere inside the cell? Yes. But as far as the big concentrations, what we're looking at is calcium outside, sodium outside, potassium inside. I think it was my wife at one point, who was a nurse, made the comment to me that the way she learned it was, when you hear about things on the news or whatever, you hear that they're notifying the next of kin, right? And so kin, K is in, and so the way to remember this is that K is in the cell, therefore sodium is out of the cell. So when we look at myocardial cells, right, or really any tissue, you have a whole bunch of cells kind of like this, and they're all packed in there together, and so they're making sheets of tissue. And so the way depolarization moves is that when one cell, so let's take this one up here, depolarizes, that provides the stimulus to all the cells around it, which tells them to depolarize. And so up next, you would have all of those guys depolarize. Those provide the stimulus to tell all the ones around them to go ahead and depolarize. So then here these go, right? And then you can kind of see how here at some point you can see the depolarization has just kind of moved through the tissues. Now, when we think of it, then we have to imagine that there's another cell sitting over here with his potassium in, his sodium out, and his calcium out. And so when this cell here starts to depolarize, when he does, that's the stimulus to tell this cell that it's time to depolarize. So once this one receives that impulse and wants to go, or the stimulus, and wants to go ahead and depolarize, there are a few actions that we see start all of this. And so the first thing that we see is all of these little sodiums, a bunch of them, are all going to start to rush into the cell. And so once we do that, then what we end up with is you got calcium out here, a little bit of sodium, but you have a whole lot now of potassium and sodium inside the cell. Now that changes the cell's electrical, like the membrane's actual voltage. And normally in a resting cell, the voltage is down here at about -90 millivolts. And when sodium rushes in, it very quickly climbs up to 0 millivolts. And so at 0 millivolts, you can see we would then not have a charge. We would be totally neutral. And so that's why we refer to this process as depolarization. Down here at 90 or -90 millivolts, the membrane of the cell was polarized. It had a charge. It was sitting there. It was negatively charged. And then very quickly, this cell basically discharges its electrical potential and heads to 0 millivolts. So it depolarizes. Now, once all of this sodium has moved into the cell like that, we see from -90 there and 0 there, we see how then the voltage is going to very quickly go to 0. Now, a lot of times sodium will kind of overshoot. We'll get a little too much sodium coming in, and so this will go on up to like 5 millivolts. And then when that happens, a couple potassiums, right, just a little bit, will start to jump out to try to get us back down to 0. So now you have this cell that has a lot of potassium in it. The sodiums are all in there. Your calciums are still outside, but some of these potassiums, a couple, have started to jump out to get us back down to 0. And then from there, what actually ends up happening is these potassiums will kind of one by one continue to start moving out. And so what the electrical potential is trying to then do is, as all of these potassiums move out, it's trying to get it back down to -90. But in order to produce a good squeeze, we actually need a plateau function or segment where we want to actually hold our voltage right there at 0 for a while to make sure that we have a good contracting time and we then efficiently pass the stimulus onto the next cell. So as all of these little potassiums are jumping out and all, the voltage is trying to return to -90, what actually ends up happening is as the potassiums are moving out, a couple of the calciums are going to start to come in. And so when that happens, when calcium starts to move into the cell in this phase, calcium starts moving in as fast as potassium is moving out, and basically they manage to cancel each other out and just kind of hold us right here at this 0 millivolts phase. Now, when that is done, and calcium is done moving in, then what ends up happening is then, because of all of that potassium that was trying to drop us back here, since that potassium is all moving out, we'll then see this phase occur here where lots of potassium is still leaving, but calcium's no longer coming in. So we see the electrical potential, the voltage of the membrane, go back to -90. Now we can look at that on this next slide here. This is over on page 51 of the book. Notice here we're at -90 millivolts. We refer to this as phase 4 of the cardiac action potential. So in phase 4, the cell is sitting there polarized at -90 millivolts. And so that's producing this little phase right there, phase 4. Now, at some period of time here, a stimulus was received. And so when this stimulus was received right here, because the cell next to it depolarized, then we're going to have all of this sodium that's going to start jumping into the cell, and we're going to start pushing up towards 0. And so as all this sodium rushes in, we go to 0. Sodium continues to rush in. We swing a little bit high. We get up here to like 5 or 10 millivolts. And at that point, a couple little potassiums jump out, and we get ourselves back to 0. Now, as potassium continues to leave, calcium is flowing in, and so we get our nice plateau phase right here. Calcium then quits flowing in, potassium continues to go out, and so here we refer to this, which is phase 3, as repolarization, because notice that now we are actually heading back towards our -90 millivolts. So now we are repolarizing, and at some point down here, the right amount of potassium has left the cell, the right amount of sodium and calcium are in it, and we manage to then sit at -90 millivolts again. Now, the important thing, though, that I don't want you to miss here is that notice that here at the beginning in phase 4, potassium was in the cell, sodium was out of the cell. But notice that by the time we repolarize, now sodium is in and potassium is out. And so the problem with that is they're now totally backwards. And so even though we have now repolarized, if we're looking at, the next function, right, the next time this cell goes to depolarize, right, and it kind of looks like that, we're not ready at this point to actually depolarize again because we're still backwards. So this is where the sodium-potassium pump comes in. And this little pump runs on ATP. which is adenosine triphosphate. And so this requires energy because everything is now pretty much balanced out. You have the right concentrations of things on either side of the membrane. And so everything is balanced, it's just in the wrong place. So at this point, the sodium-potassium pump turns on. He is going to grab some amount of potassium. So let's say there's our cell. So there's some sodiums in it. This little sodium-potassium pump that's sitting there in the membrane is going to turn on, and it's going to grab a few potassiums, a few sodiums, and it's actually then going to just switch them. Once it does that, it's going to continue to do that until we end up with all the sodium outside again and all the potassium on the inside. And at that point, we are now back here ready to depolarize again for the next beat. So keep in mind, at a heart rate of 60, right, we're getting 1 beat per second. At a heart rate of 120, we get 1 beat every half of a second. So we see heart rates of 120 all the time. I mean, most people, who were at all young and healthy can get on a treadmill and get themselves up to 120. But notice that this entire process then has to be able to take place faster than every half second. We need sodium to flow into the cell, a little potassium leave the cell, calcium start flowing in as potassium goes out. Potassium then continues to go out after calcium has stopped, and then we turn on the sodium-potassium pump and then switch these back around. And we have to be able to do this all within a matter of just milliseconds. And that's probably the most impressive part of depolarization. This little picture here just kind of reminds you of how depolarization works. Picture people in a football stadium doing the wave. And so if we were to just kind of randomly pick some people, right, like let's just take those people right there in that row. The reason that those people are going to stand up when they're doing the wave is because the people right there stood up. And the reason those guys stood up was because the people right there stood up. And so the wave is the perfect example of the people beside of you are doing something. That's the stimulus that tells you to do it. And then when you do it, that's the stimulus that tells the other person to do it. And that's essentially how depolarization is moving through the heart. When we get further into the book and we start talking about some more of the arrhythmias, that's when more of how depolarization works is really going to start coming up later. But I just want to make sure that we were all on the same page here with the basics of depolarization, and we will move on from here. Thanks.